Hey, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Hanging On to Hope podcast.
I'm Brenda J.
And I'm Karen Wonder.
And we are HangingOnToHope.org.
This podcast is intended as educational and is not psychological or medical advice. Always consult a professional when needed, and we disclaim any liability in connection with the instruction, information, or advice given.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hanging On to Hope podcast. This is Brenda J. So today we have Jess Nagy on the show. Jess is the founder of Mosaic Motherhood. She is certified in trauma support, mental health coaching, NLP, and Tru316 Bible Study resources. She has been building communities in English and Spanish for the last 20 years across North America. She combines her experience. Basically, she knows the pain of living in a destructive marriage and trying to navigate co-parenting after leaving her marriage. And she has expertise in coaching and facilitating to give you the strategies and techniques to help you on your own post-traumatic parenting journey. And most of all, give you hope. So welcome to the show, Jess.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hi, this is Karen. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too, Karen.
So would you like to just tell our listeners a little of your story and how it led up to Mosaic Motherhood?
Yeah. So a few years ago, I was sitting in church with tears streaming down my face, as often happens in church. And the chairs were packed. It was a full house, but nobody offered me a tissue or even asked if I was okay. Up on the screen, a father swung his little boy around like Superman, and Chainsmokers, something just like this, played in the background. And I remember thinking, I wish my kids had that. I was surrounded by people and the loneliest I've ever been. Fast forward a few months, and I was imagining myself on the freeway, pressing my foot on the gas, lifting my hands off the wheel, and bracing for impact. I fantasized about driving my car off the road, but there were 3 reasons I didn't. An 8-month-old boy, a 3-year-old girl, and someone I could call on to drive. I don't know that I ever would have gotten help for just myself, but when the pain of my marriage began making it impossible for me to show up well as a mom, I knew something had to change. So I can say with conviction that my kids saved my life. And now on the other side of my destructive marriage, Mosaic Motherhood was born out of my desire to repay the favor and figuratively save theirs.
Wow, that's a powerful story.
Definitely. Wow. You say on your website, without a strong sense of community or resources, I was not doing a great job of parenting my children or taking care of myself. I was surviving, but isolated and lonely, numbing out on Netflix and chocolate, while oblivious to the destruction occurring right under my own roof. Did you want to expound on that?
Basically, I was believing the lie that just hoping and praying for my marriage was going to fix it. And even though I could see that wasn't working, my entire Christian conviction was built on a combination of things someone had told me growing up about men and women and legalistic teachings of submit, obey, and encourage. At that point, there was so much cognitive dissonance that I couldn't survive in reality when it was smashed up against my beliefs. So I just didn't. I escaped. And for a lot of people, I think it didn't look like escape because I still showed up physically for the necessities of life. You know, kids fed, clothed, house cleaned, dinner on the table, family comes to town, entertaining, smile on my face, go to church. But any chance I got, I'd disappear into a book or a TV show or a carton of ice cream. And I'd always heard about this doing life together in the context of church small groups. But let me tell you, that never seemed to work out for me. And I lived for my Friday morning moms group, but Friday morning never carried over to Saturday or Monday or Wednesday when I was drowning. And I had no idea what it really looked like to live in community. I heard people talk a big game, but I had no idea what they were talking about.
So you didn't feel like you got support? Did you reach out to people at church and just didn't feel like anyone was?
Oh, goodness. I think I spewed my story to anyone who would listen.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, at first, I remember, I'm not sure what people were thinking when I first got out.
right.
The more you talk about it, the more it helped you heal. It just probably drove everyone else nuts. I think I did.
I think it's hard when you get responses that are very like Christianese or talk that quoted Bible verses that just don't help your situation.
Right.
So is that the kind of responses you were getting?
Yeah, absolutely. And when I say that I like spewed my story, that was before my awakening. I was just trying to get someone to validate me or hear me in a way that wasn't basically, yeah, that's not happening, or, oh, but he's such a nice guy, or something in between, or like you say, just a cliche response, or pray without ceasing, or have a book shoved in your face and that sort of thing.
I think during your marriage, same thing.
Yeah, I can
Sorry
really
to interrupt
relate.
you. Yeah,
I can really relate to what you're saying too. And
it's
I think
interesting that when I finally decided and discovered like the reality of things, I just shut up. Whereas I think a lot of women tend to isolate in hopes of carrying on this front that they have. And that was just the opposite of the way that my situation operated. I mean, I would try and say, something's not right here, up until the point when I realized that I was right and something wasn't right there. And then I was like, you know what? I have spent all of these years trying to get these people to believe me. They're not going to believe me now. So why bother?
Yeah. And for me, I had a moment where it was just a supernatural moment where God validated me. And that's something, that's why to me, spiritual abuse is so important, because it's like, it was just God, just this experience of him letting me know, like all those verses out of context, that's not me.
Yeah.
All those things all those books that are really not focused on the right things or over focused on a submission thing or something are not really from me. And that was like a turning point for me. I mean, it's not like everything changed on that moment, but it was really just to have that validation.
And I think I was on the opposite extreme, like you were saying, the other reactions where I'm trying to raise the kids and I knew something was wrong the whole time, but I just thought in the church I was supposed to accept it by all the answers that I got.
Right.
That's where I was
That's where you're led to believe.
I guess I'm just stuck until he cheats.
Yeah.
That's basically where I was at.
Yeah, kind of thing.
Oh my goodness. I can't tell you how many times I swear I actually prayed for that.
So did Karen, didn't you?
Yes. I know, you're in a bad spot.
I'm like, prayer. God, just let me catch him in something.
I know. I'm like, that's so bad. So on this podcast, we have not yet talked about raising your children with a destructive co-parent. On Instagram, you talk about what compromise with a destructive co-parent looks like, and you give 4 examples. You also provide a diagram that shows how to have a thriving family culture. Did you want to expand and explain to our listeners what a healthy parent should be doing?
Yeah, so I find that compromise means different things to different people and in different circumstances. So to kind of give some background, when I say compromise, in quotations, with a destructive co-parent, that can look like making a conscious decision to do more than our quote unquote fair share of the work, if it's in the best interest of our child and it doesn't dishonor us. For example, if a client is choosing to stay in her destructive marriage, which is a valid choice in certain circumstances, I might ask her or invite her to think about, like, what portion of the work would she be doing if she was a single mom? And if she would be doing that if the circumstances were different, can she get her mind and her heart to a place where she can do it in the circumstances that she has? And if a client has separated or divorced her destructive spouse, I might invite her to consider whether or not it is hurting her to move more than halfway in dad's direction on something. And if it isn't, will it hurt the child if she doesn't? And so I tend to coach women that compromise looks a lot more in these sets of circumstances like compromising on rather than a meeting in the middle. Because most times, if a spouse or an ex is truly destructive, there won't be any meeting in the middle anyway.
Right.
And then as for the thriving family culture, I think the particular diagram that's on my page is credited actually to a colleague, Kirsten Kirchsteiger. But I do have one that's very similar that shows all the dangers of parenting out of only 1 or 2 or 3 spheres, whereas parenting with considering all of the 4, which I would consider to be myself, God, my children, and others, is a much more balanced model. And that's what I call village parenting. And basically the premise of village parenting is the old African proverb that says it takes a village to raise a child, which in fundamentalist Christian culture has kind of been blacklisted as a political agenda. But really, I see in scripture is the way that God is calling us to live in unity in the church. Our children, especially the ones that are in destructive family systems, need more than just the healthy parent speaking truth into their lives, because the unhealthy parent has his or her own version of the truth, in air quotes.
Yeah.
And that becomes a battle that everyone loses. Nobody's going to win that battle. Whereas if our children are surrounded by healthy adults who love them and will speak truth into their lives, even when in their minds, mom knows nothing, they still have a long list of esteemed adults they can go to for answers. And in fact, I believe it was Harvard that did a study and came out with some of like the ACE antidote. That's my own term for it. I don't know what they called it, but they have the ACEs study, the adverse childhood experiences. And then I think Harvard did a study and created a list of things that will be indicators of overcoming those sort of adverse childhood experiences. And the number one indicator is having a safe place to land, aka a parent who can provide that. And then the number 2 indicator is having a safe non-parent adult who they can go to.
Yeah, I wish I would have known all this when I first got out. My kids have kind of just backed away from the church, and what I should have done is just got more plugged in. And I prayed and prayed for God to bring them someone like that, and he hasn't yet. So that's tough. I mean, it would have been nice to know all this years ago.
Yeah, it's difficult to find that too, because I have a friend in Texas that she's a single mom. She's a widow, and, you know, she's had a lot of issues with her kids, and she struggled, you know, because I was giving her advice, and she's like, well, help me find someone like that, because, you know, it's hard to find someone that's willing to commit and, you know, do that. It's just there's not enough men like that or people that can come.
Well, I think it goes back to there's just so few people who understand what destruction or destructiveness or toxicity or narcissism or any term that you want to throw at it, abuse, can look like when it doesn't include bruises. And sometimes even when it does, let's be honest.
Right.
Yeah.
So if we just had more people, more training in the church and more people who would listen and believe, I think the first 2 steps, listen and believe, or even, you know, the next thing that could be saying, I don't know where you should go from here, but I'll walk alongside you as we figure it out.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
That would be supportive to hear for sure.
We definitely agree on that.
Yeah.
We talk about boundaries a lot on this podcast. A lot of your posts talk about learning to say no. Can you explain to our listeners why they are so important with an abusive ex, especially when children are involved?
So this is another area where my concept of boundaries is slightly off center from what a lot of people think they are. So I don't know what your definition of boundaries has been, but I have several examples of what boundaries are like on Instagram and Facebook. But my all-time favorite analogy is that boundaries are like cell membranes. They're semi-permeable, they're gatekeepers, they're protectors, they're organizers. They determine what enters and how much. They allow and keep the toxicity out while allowing and keeping the healthy in. And then they identify things, communicate things, regulate, and when necessary, isolate. And I find a lot of people think of boundaries like brick walls. And especially when you're waking up to an abusive relationship, finding your voice can be so empowering. We tend to swing 180 degrees in the opposite direction of where we were and make these hard and fast rules for our partners or our exes that are really only going to serve to enrage them. And I'll say that I was guilty of that in the beginning, but I quickly realized that the more you fight a narcissist, the more likely he is to dig in his heels and find a way to win. And so that's not good for you or your children. And so I like to say that our no is really more about how and when we say it rather than that we say it. And I have a few verses that I use to back this up. I mean, there are some that are kind of obvious, like Proverbs says, a gentle answer turns away wrath, or do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you become like him yourself. So that would be like the how. We need to be gentle. If we can see that his mind is not going to be changed, there's no point in arguing. And the when can sort of be illustrated in these two proverbs. And one of them is, if a wise man has an argument with a fool, the fool only rages and laughs, and there is no quiet. And I have experienced that. And then it's an honor for a person to keep aloof from strife, but every fool will be quarreling. Like those fools be arguing all the time. And sometimes it's necessary to speak up in order to gain clarity. But once you and or your kids, depending on their ages, have that clarity, it's really in everyone's best interest to keep from arguing with said fool in your lives.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's not going to
agree with that.
Yeah.
I like your definition of boundaries. I did read that on your post. I agree with it.
Yeah, I do too. I've never heard it described that way, but I definitely agree with it.
Yeah. Easy to understand.
So we have a quote from Karen Purvis from your Instagram post. And she says, before you can lead a child to healing, you must know the path yourself. Did you want to kind of expound on that?
Oh, this quote is really a double-edged sword. It's sort of the antidote to saying, do as I say, not as I do. And I mean, my parents are boomers. They had me late in life. So I heard that a lot. And as much as it pains me to admit, because being imperfect and all, nobody can appropriately model something that they don't walk out.
Right.
So as moms, we need our healing to be in progress before we can expect to help our children heal.
Yeah.
And this is why I actually rarely work with women who are still struggling with the destruction in their marriage. I would rather refer them out to colleagues like Natalie Hoffman, Leslie Vernick, Eric McDougall, Joy Forrest, maybe the two of you. Those women aren't quite ready to help their kids yet. Just like I wasn't ready when I was still numbing out on Netflix and chocolate. Yeah. That said, I'm never going to say to someone, you need to have your healing complete, because it's never complete.
Right. It's always an ongoing process.
It's always ongoing. But if we're moving in the direction of healing and growth, and we've gained clarity about the situation and have made a choice with ownership of that choice as to what we're doing about it today. And that could be in this moment. It could be like today, it could be this week, it could be this year. Then we can help our children heal and build their resilience at the same time.
See, I waited too long. My youngest was 16 and the other two were grown up. And when I finally got out, I was healing and my kids just kept saying, you're so selfish. You're so selfish. But I knew that I was such a mess that there was no way it's going to be able to help them. You're exactly right. It just, but I wish if I would have gotten out earlier, would have had a lot more time to help them. And I feel like I didn't have that. But now they're older and we're working on it, but it's a mess. It's a big, big mess. So, I mean, I'm glad that you're on this podcast to help people that have younger children and be able to listen to this so they don't make the same mistakes I made.
Yeah. Well, I'm so sorry that it ended up in a mess for you.
So you give an example of 3 scripts to use when your kids, or anyone for that matter, speak disrespectfully. Did you want to go over those and explain?
Sure. So these are super simple scripts, and a couple of them I actually found in Dr. Karen Purvis's book. So one of those is, are you asking or telling? And this helps them reformulate their statement into a request. Our culture has such a problem with asking for help, and yet we have no problem making demands. And so I use this as a boundary that says, I'm not okay with you commanding me to do things, but I'm happy to help if you ask. Yeah. And this is so important for me, for my kids, but you're right. This can be for absolutely anyone. It can be for, the cashier who wants to hurry you along. It can be for the person in line behind you who's like pushing you forward. It can be for your parents who really just don't get it. So that would be the first one. And the second one is, can you try that again? And I have a really hard time not letting my voice get sassy on this one. I'm going to be honest. But this is sort of like when they get sassy, or they made a demand and I really want to get sassy back with them. And I want to let them know, like, yeah, no, I'm not having that, but I tend towards sarcasm and sassiness. So this is one that I personally have to work on and say sweetly, can you try that again? Not, you want to try that again? So I'm usually asking for a rephrase, but this gives them the freedom to be creative with their response. I'll tell you a little story. My son is 5. And I can't remember how old he was when he came up with this, but I asked him to do like 3 things in sequence and I was overwhelmed and in a rush. So I probably didn't ask them very slowly or wait to see if he was responding. And he's like, you're asking me too many things. And so I said, can you try that again? And he says, Mommy, I'm not an octopus. I can't do that many things at once. And I just thought it was just so cute and creative the way that he made those connections. And now it's a running joke in our house that when I ask them to do too many things, they're like, I'm not an octopus. And I just giggle and we move on.
Oh.
And then the last one is gentle your voice and try again. And this one is by far the most common in our house. So if you've ever heard of the acronym RBF, then I have a new one for you. RBV. I grew up with a mom who sounded angry anytime she opened her mouth to speak. And unfortunately, apples and trees, etc. This one basically says that like the content of whatever you just said was fine, but the tone wasn't. And considering the statistics that, what is it, like 38, 40 something % of our communication is our tone, it's so crucial. And I also let my kids call me out on this one. Well, I let them call me out on all of them, but this one is the one they pull out the most. And I want them to know that it's a 2-way street. Mom doesn't get to have a double standard here. And frankly, I think I came up with this one for me. I just didn't notice I needed it until my child opened her mouth and I came out.
That's good. Well, this is good for abusers to use this with abusers, like not even just children. Like if I would have had done all these 3 questions with my abuser, I would have left a long time ago.
Yeah. And it's interesting too. I heard, I can't remember, just in a random passing conversation, but like teaching my kids the fruit of the spirit, gentleness is listed there. And it's one that's sort of been underrated. We don't hear often sermons preached on gentleness. We hear a lot about self-control and faithfulness and kindness and all of that. But that's sort of where I came up with, like, soften your voice. That doesn't make sense because then they're going to start whispering. No, I want their voice to be gentle. I want the way they speak with people to be gentle. And a lot of that came from just the verbal abuse that I endured.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that.
I do too, because that is something you crave if you're with someone that's harsh.
Right.
You want gentle. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you talk about child-focused co-parenting without drama. Can you tell our listeners what that is and what it would look like?
So I think this one goes back to compromise and boundaries and the questions that you asked about that. Like, drama is avoided when we're able to give the destructive co-parent what they want, or at least make it seem like we are. One example from my own life is when my kiddo forgot her school shoes at my house during a parenting transition. And my thought, and the way that we have always interacted on pickup days, pickup at school, but in the occasion like summer breaks or whatever, where pickup doesn't happen at school, then it's whoever the parent picking up, it's their responsibility to make sure that the kids have everything that they need for their time at their house. Well, of course, he doesn't do that. And he usually leaves it to me. And it was one of those things where either I forgot or I was too busy or I got distracted or whatever. Anyway, her shoes stayed here and she has a uniform. So I get a text message at like 6:30 in the morning and it says, you forgot to give me her shoes and I don't have time to come pick them up. And so can you bring them to me? And of course I'm annoyed because no, I don't want to drive the 5 miles to go and give them to him. But at the same time, I began asking myself, who's going to be hurt or who's going to lose if I don't do this? I had the time to take those 30 minutes, 15 minutes there and 15 minutes back to take the shoes to her. If I didn't take the shoes to her, she's either going to be late, which terrifies this particular child, or she's going to go to school with an incomplete uniform, which is something that she's never done and probably would terrify her just as much. And so I could still honor myself and say, I'm going to choose to give in this situation because it benefits my child and it doesn't hurt me. And this is where the drama was avoided. I can just say, okay, I'm going to drive them over this time, but the next time this happens, I won't be taking them over. And that puts him on warning that this is my boundary. And it also shows my child that above all else, I am choosing her and what her experience is going to be like.
It's good.
Yeah, that is. It's putting her considerations above other things. Yeah.
You say, I spend a lot of time alone, but I'm no longer lonely. We've talked about this a little in the past. What does this mean and how does it relate to your story? How did you overcome this?
So similar to the piece of my story that I shared at the beginning, I often say the loneliest place is a crowded room. When you don't feel seen or heard or known, being around people is excruciating because whether it's true or not, it seems like everyone else is seen or known or heard and you're not. And when you do feel seen or heard or known, when you do feel seen and heard and known, when you're secure in yourself and in God's love, it doesn't matter how much time you spend by yourself, you can hold on to that feeling of being known. And obviously the degree can be different for introverts and extroverts, but the idea is the same.
Yeah.
For me, I overcame my loneliness by being super intentional about setting up community for myself wherever I went, with people who could understand my experience without needing to be convinced. And that did include a couple of in-person groups, but it mainly consisted of online support. And COVID taught us that face-to-face interaction is necessary for mental health. But it also taught us that when we share vulnerably with others in a virtual space, we can still be the hands and feet of Jesus across the miles. And since I was able to do that for myself in my transition journey, part of what I set out to do with Mosaic Motherhood was to see whether or not I could help others build it as well. And it turns out you can.
You talk about having radical self-love and that self-care has become such a big buzzword that we have lost sight of what that means. When we clear the junk out of the way, the heart of it is loving you. Can you expound on this and why it's so important to win this war, not only on ourselves, but for our children?
Yeah, I think to speak to the self-care buzzword, if I were to poll 100 women as to what they think of first when they hear the word self-care, probably at least 80 of them would say something like a bubble bath or massage. And while those things can be self-care, there's so much more to self-love than just a fleeting pampering session. Self-love in the Bible's implied. We are the temple of the Holy Spirit, and we're supposed to treat our bodies with respect because of that. Jesus said we're to love our neighbor as ourselves. And then Paul talks about in Ephesians, and I know this is a triggering verse, but it talks about us treating our spouse as we would treat ourselves. That's the way that the Bible sets this up. And this can be the same in regarding the way that we treat our children. Personally, I want my kids to grow up seeing this modeled. How can I say to my daughter, you're beautiful and smart and talented, even when you mess up, if I'm constantly berating myself for my mistakes out loud in front of her? I go back to more is caught than taught.
Yeah.
And when it comes to self-compassion, self-love, and self-care, our culture is not going to teach those things to our children. And even Christian culture is not doing a good job of teaching those things to us or to our children. So we have to.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that's a big issue for me that I'm finding is that I remember taking a course a couple of years ago on self-compassion, and she had you like that inner voice that you hear. It's like you'd almost like it was a real person, like really listen to that. Cause we tend to tune it out.
Yeah.
I did that whole course. I was horrified at like the things that I would say to myself. Cause I never really paid attention when I stopped and listened. I'm like, I would never talk to my friends that way, but I'm like, I'm abusing myself the way. And then I've gotten away from doing that course, and now I'm in a new job, and I've just had to be really careful what I say to myself. Cause they're not saying bad things to me like, oh, hurry up, you're not doing this fast enough. But I tell myself, you're not smart enough or things like that. So that's something I feel like I have to work on.
Yeah, I think this is one of the hardest things that has been unlearning for me as well.
Yeah, definitely hard.
That isn't easy.
Although I will say that I got to a point at one point in my healing and have since gone backwards, but I did get to a point where I was able to sort of think like, I am a spoiled little daddy's girl. If my daddy owns the cattle on 10,000 hills, then I should have steak to eat. Of course, it is all of that many more years that I was thinking, oh, I don't deserve the steak and I shouldn't have nice things. And there are still so many areas where I need to grow in that. Like there was that point, and then I stepped backwards and I have to keep pushing to that point and reminding myself of that point. And I love when a mentor of mine said, how would you talk to your friend if she just messed up the way that you messed up?
Right. That was part of what they said in that course too.
That's good.
Yeah.
I took a long time to just to love myself, be like more kind to myself.
Yeah.
Really, that took a long and I'm still hard on myself, but not like I used to be. I used to be way worse. So you say respect is a foundation of love. Can you explain? We don't really talk about respect too much on the podcast. We haven't yet.
Well, and I think
we all want to be respected.
We do. And I would say,
to be continued. Stay tuned for next week's part 2. You don't want to miss it.
Thanks for tuning in to Hanging On to Hope. Check out our website, hangingontohope.org. There are resources on there, and if you would like to donate or volunteer, you can do that through our website. We are a brand new nonprofit, so we appreciate any and all support. And we thank you for listening, and until next time, keep hanging on to hope. We are evidence that there is hope and healing for you, and our passion is to help you find it too. So thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening, everyone.